Picture the architecture diagram on the wall. A few core systems of record sit in neat boxes, arrows connect them, and a sensible ring of controls wraps around what everyone calls the crown jewels. Now shift perspective and follow a single customer or patient record through its real life. It appears in a support ticket, in a verbose log, in a spreadsheet attached to a chat, in an analytics dashboard, and eventually in a knowledge store feeding an internal assistant powered by artificial intelligence, AI. The tidy diagram fades. What you see instead is a small set of platforms quietly accumulating copies, fragments, and context about that record over months and years. That is where your sensitive information actually syncs. This is part of the Wednesday headline feature from Bare Metal Cyber magazine, developed by Bare Metal Cyber, and it is about learning to see and govern those gravity wells before they define your next incident.
If you sit next to an engineer or analyst and trace one person's data through a working day, you will notice how casually it escapes its original home. A support agent pastes full identity details and a screenshot into a ticket so the issue is easier to reproduce. A sales slide borrows a real account name, revenue number, and region just for internal use. A developer turns on detailed logging to debug a rollout, and those traces now contain identifiers, payload snippets, and sometimes secrets. None of these moments feel like strategic architecture decisions. Together, they redraw the map of where sensitive attributes live, and they quietly feed a growing ring of systems that orbit your original applications.
Over time, those orbits settle into patterns. Security events carrying user and transaction details land in a Security Information and Event Management, or SIEM, platform. Batch jobs and streaming pipelines push behavioral data and partial payloads into a cloud analytics environment. Integrations sync subsets of customer records into half a dozen tools wrapped around a customer relationship management, or CRM, core. Collaboration suites turn into the default scratchpad for sharing exports, screenshots, and diagnostic dumps. Each of these destinations holds a different slice of the story, but certain platforms see the same sensitive attributes again and again. That repetition is what turns a busy system into a data gravity well, even if no one ever called it that.
From an attacker's point of view, those wells are often more interesting than the original systems of record. An identity provider may be carefully hardened and audited, while a forgotten log store retains long-lived tokens. A regulated core banking platform may enforce strict controls, while a downstream analytics cluster quietly holds years of transaction histories joined to user attributes and device fingerprints. A human resources, HR, application or electronic health record, EHR, may be tightly wrapped, while a collaboration suite exposes large archives of exported reports and ad hoc analyses. The practical blast radius of a compromise is less about where data started and more about where it has pooled, enriched with context, and made broadly accessible in the name of insight or convenience.
The reason these wells form is not mysterious. Data gravity begins with simple economics. It is always cheaper, in time and attention, to connect one more feed into an existing platform than to create and govern a new one. If a log system already ingests endpoint events, it feels natural to send application traces there. If a data lake already powers key dashboards, it becomes the default landing zone for new feeds. Each integration increases the platform's usefulness and makes it the obvious place to plug the next project. Over months and years, that one more feed thinking creates centers of mass that hold more of your sensitive information than any single line of business application.
Analytics and artificial intelligence, once introduced, deepen the well. Teams building dashboards, models, and co-pilots want broad, consistent visibility, not a patchwork of partial views. The simplest way to achieve that is to funnel more data into the places they already use. Just land it in the lake and index it into the Corp Assistant become routine answers. The result is not only more volume, but more variety. Identifiers, free text, behavioral traces, and business context that were never combined before. That variety is what makes these platforms so powerful for the business
and it is the same quality that makes them such attractive targets for attackers and a source of worry for regulators. Vendor ecosystems add their own pull. A collaboration suite that becomes the standard work surface attracts sensitive chats, documents, recordings, and whiteboards, because that is where people live during their day. A customer relationship management environment becomes the unofficial center of gravity for every go-to-market integration, drawing in data from marketing, support, billing, and product usage. A security platform that aggregates logs from across the estate becomes the canonical lens on user and system behavior. People, budgets, and contracts all align around these platforms, which makes them hard to challenge, even when their risk profile has shifted from tool to system of exposure.
The tension for leaders is that most security programs are still anchored in an older mental model. They treat core systems of record as the primary risk objects: the employee system, the claims engine, the trading platform, the main billing system. These are the assets that earn special labels: segmentation, compensating controls, and board-level diagrams. Meanwhile, the data wells holding the richest blends of that information often sit under different leadership, with controls that are inherited, partial, or assumed rather than deliberately designed. An analytics environment may report into a data leader, a collaboration stack into a workplace or information technology function, and an emerging artificial intelligence corpus into an innovation or product team.
That misalignment seeps into many control areas. Data classification efforts frequently focus on schemas in core applications while ignoring tables and object stores in analytics or observability platforms. Access reviews are conducted rigorously for application roles, but less so for broad query access, service accounts, and integration keys into those wells. Data loss controls may be tuned at email or internet gateways, while internal platforms allow bulk exports, unmonitored sharing, and long-lived access tokens. When incidents land on your desk involving a misconfigured storage bucket or compromised analytics user, the root cause is often that the platform was never treated as a first-class system of exposure, even though it held first-class data.
The reality is that your most important attack surfaces for sensitive information are defined by the handful of places where data converges, not by the dozens of systems where it originates. A single overprivileged data engineer, an external partner with expansive application programming interface access, or an assistant integration configured with overly broad scopes can move across business units and time horizons in ways that a traditional system-by-system threat model never anticipated. Leaders who recognize this begin to expand the idea of Tier 0 to include not only identity and core infrastructure, but also the few platforms whose compromise would transform a foothold into a cross-cutting regulatory or reputational crisis. Owning this reality starts with a different kind of mapping exercise. Instead of asking which applications are most critical, you ask where a determined actor could see full customer identity, long-lived account identifiers, regulated financial or health attributes, or multi-year behavioral histories in one place. In many organizations, that question surfaces a short list: the main analytics or data science environment, one or two collaboration suites, major customer or employee platforms, key observability or security tools, and one or more artificial intelligence or vector stores. The goal is not a perfect static diagram. It is a living map that names the wells where sensitive information actually syncs and treats them as such. Once you have a credible map, the next move is to assign real ownership. Each well needs a clearly accountable senior owner, not a committee or a dotted line. That person accepts that the platform is Tier 0 for data, even if it does not run domain controllers or core transaction processing. They push to align identity and access models with your primary identity provider. They ensure that strong authentication and conditional policies are enforced, and they insist that logging and monitoring are designed for visibility into misuse as well as failure. They work with privacy and legal teams to interpret regulatory duties for the data types present, and they ensure that backup, recovery, and incident response plans treat the well as a critical service rather than a convenient utility. Governance then moves from generic documents to specific guardrails. You might decide that only particular teams can land raw production data into the analytics environment, and only through controlled ingestion paths that apply minimization or tokenization. You might establish that exports from the collaboration platform above certain thresholds are logged, reviewable, and subject to periodic sampling. You may push encryption, masking, and data loss detection closer to the wells, rather than relying solely on traffic controls at the edge. These kinds of choices do not eliminate data gravity, but they give it shape. They turn invisible accumulation into an intentional, named responsibility tied to known platforms and people.
None of this comes without friction. Declaring a platform a gravity well and treating it accordingly often means slowing down some experiments, saying no to informal data copies, or asking product and data teams to route work through curated paths rather than whatever is most convenient. It may require stepping up to higher security tiers for cloud and software providers, renegotiating contracts, and explaining to business leaders why a familiar tool has suddenly become a focus of scrutiny. The alternative, though, is to maintain the illusion that risk is still defined entirely by the tidy boxes on the original diagram, and to be genuinely surprised by the size of the blast radius when a supposedly supporting platform fails or is breached.
Artificial intelligence assistants and multi-cloud patterns are already amplifying these dynamics. Internal co-pilots that answer natural language questions across documents, tickets, and code need to see a wide corpus. It is tempting to give them sight of collaboration archives, repositories in analytics stores, or even production mirrors. Multi-cloud integration layers promise unified fabric views, encouraging teams to stitch data from multiple providers into coherent models. Each of these moves deepens existing wells and creates new ones. The more helpful the assistant or dashboard becomes, the more likely it is that it has seen exactly the combinations of sensitive attributes that regulators and attackers care about most.
Leaders do have room to bend this gravity. One pattern is to formally bless a small number of wells as the right homes for certain categories of sensitive data, and then invest heavily in making those homes safe and comprehensible. Instead of letting every artificial intelligence feature crawl arbitrary content, you define curated indexes built from known sources with redaction rules, quality checks, and retention boundaries. Instead of allowing each cloud estate to build its own parallel data lake for the same purpose, you choose where centralization is acceptable and where fragmentation is a safety feature. You can decide that some classes of data should never be combined, even if the analytics temptation is strong, and you can encode that decision in architecture and contracts, not just intention.
Vendor management becomes part of your exposure map rather than an afterthought. When you onboard a new analytics platform, observability stack, or artificial intelligence provider, you ask not only about features and cost, but also about data locality, retention, cross-tenant isolation, and auditability. You treat the vendor's environment as a gravity well that extends your own. That means asking how you will see their logs during an incident, how quickly you can export or delete your corpus, and what guarantees exist about training, sharing, or reuse of your data. Over the next few years, the leaders who can explain to boards and regulators where their most sensitive information sits, why it sits there, and how it is governed will be at a real advantage.
Stepping back, the core mental shift is simple to state and hard to fully adopt. At its heart, this topic is about accepting that sensitive data follows its own physics. It responds to incentives, convenience, and the hunger for insight, not just to diagrams and control matrices. Once you internalize that, you stop treating data gravity wells as oddities or one-off mistakes, and start treating them as the predictable outcome of how the organization has been building and integrating systems. You then have a choice: quietly hope that nothing bad happens in those wells, or deliberately map, own, and shape them as the true centers of exposure they have become.
When leaders make that shift, several conversations change. Investment discussions move from broad data platform line items to targeted conversations about protecting specific wells that define the blast radius of a breach. Ownership debates focus on who is accountable for the exposure at each well, not just who administers the software. Conversations with product, data, and engineering leaders become more explicit about the trade-offs between speed, analytics power, and concentration risk. Even board updates improve because they describe tangible places where risk is concentrated and managed, rather than abstract lists of tools and initiatives.
The first practical step does not require a new framework. Ask your team to identify the platforms where someone, with the access they legitimately have today, can see complete customer, employee, or critical asset data in aggregate. Ask how those platforms are protected, monitored, and governed compared to the traditional crown jewels. Then look at upcoming analytics, artificial intelligence, or integration projects and ask where their data will land and what wells they will deepen. Those two sets of questions will quickly surface both your existing gravity wells and the ones forming on the horizon. From there, you can decide where to centralize, where to fragment, and where to invest, so that the places your sensitive information inevitably sinks are the same places you have chosen to defend with your greatest care.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.